It happened so quickly that I barely had time to react. 1 minute, I was walking down the street, minding my business, when a police officer pulled up behind me. I heard the screech of his tires as he stopped just a little too close. My heart raced, not from fear, but from the unsettling familiarity of being questioned for no reason at all. He stepped out of the car, towering over me. His uniform, pressed and pristine, made him seem even more imposing, his face hard as stone. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his tone dripping with suspicion. I froze for a second, caught off guard by the aggression in his voice. "I'm just walking home," I said, trying to remain calm, but my voice betrayed the tension bubbling inside me. I had done nothing wrong, yet here I was, about to be judged based on nothing but the color of my skin. The officer didn't care about my explanation. He didn't care that I wasn't causing any trouble. What I saw next made my stomach churn. Without warning, he shoved me hard in the chest, sending me stumbling backward. I caught myself, only to feel the sharp kick that followed. It came so fast and so brutally that it knocked the air from my lungs. The sheer force of it sent me sprawling onto the ground. I could barely breathe. I lay there for a second, stunned, the pain of the kick searing through me, a feeling of powerlessness creeping over me like a dark cloud. "Get up!" he screamed, his voice filled with anger and authority. But all I could do was stare up at him, a mixture of pain and disbelief in my eyes. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to scream. But the fear of escalating things further made me stay silent, my body trembling. I didn't know what would happen next, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. The officer stood over me, his chest heaving with exertion as he waited for me to rise. But then, as if out of nowhere, there was a sound, a screech of tires, the distant roar of an engine. I couldn't place it at first, but it was unmistakable, something was coming, and I was about to experience a change I hadn't expected. The next few minutes would be unforgettable. I was still trying to gather my thoughts when the sound grew louder, the engine revving up as it pulled closer. The officer didn't seem to notice it at first, too focused on me, too caught up in whatever power trip he was on. But something changed. I saw his eyes flicker, his gaze darting over my shoulder, narrowing with recognition. He stopped, mid-shout, looking toward the approaching vehicle as it screeched to a halt just a few feet away. The door slammed open, and out stepped a man I didn't recognize at first, but the officer did. The newcomer's boots hit the pavement with a solid thud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black jacket and sunglasses. He walked toward us with deliberate, confident strides. Something about his posture told me he wasn't just another civilian. The officer's face changed the moment he saw him. The brash confidence I had seen earlier evaporated, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice steady and calm. The officer, now visibly rattled, straightened up and tried to collect himself. "No, sir. Just a misunderstanding," he stammered. I could tell he was doing his best to regain control of the situation, but the man's presence was undeniable. He stepped forward with purpose, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. I stayed on the ground, still stunned by the kick and now this unexpected turn of events. Who was this man, and why did the officer suddenly seem so small in comparison to him? The officer looked like he wanted to argue, to continue pushing me around, but he didn't. Not anymore. The man's gaze shifted to me, and he took a step closer, crouching slightly to meet my eyes. There was no judgment, no question in his look, just a calm recognition of the pain I had just endured. "You all right?" he asked softly. I nodded, but I didn't trust my voice just yet. My chest ached from the kick, but something else stirred inside me. Was this the moment things would change? Would this stranger bring the justice I so desperately needed? Before I could answer, the man turned back to the officer. "Get back in your car," he ordered, his voice now carrying a weight that made even the officer hesitate. The tone wasn't just commanding, it was filled with an authority that was unshakable. The officer looked around, unsure of what to do, his face flushed. The man's words were not a suggestion, they were a direct command. Now, the man said again, this time with even more intensity. For a long, tense moment, the officer stared at him, his hand hovering near his belt. Then, as if coming to a reluctant decision, he turned on his heel and walked back toward his car, casting a quick glance over his shoulder before slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, he sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. The man stood there for a few moments longer, watching the officer leave, before turning back to me. "You all right?" he asked again, his voice now softer. This time, I managed to nod, but there was a storm inside me. Something told me this wasn't the end of the story, this was just the beginning. The man didn't move right away. He just stood there, watching me as I slowly picked myself up from the asphalt, my body stiff and sore from the officer's kick. My hands trembled as I pushed myself into a sitting position, trying to steady myself. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the tension in the air still palpable. The officer was gone, but I wasn't sure if that was a victory or just a temporary reprieve. I had no idea who this stranger was, but something about him felt different. He had an aura of calm authority that seemed almost tangible, like he was someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and still stood strong. The man crouched down in front of me, his eyes locking onto mine with a look that wasn't pity, it was understanding. He didn't see me as a victim, just someone caught in a messed up situation. "You should head home," he said softly, his voice almost comforting. "But first, let me give you something." I looked at him, confused. Was he offering me help? Some kind of assistance? I didn't know how to respond, but before I could speak, he pulled something out of his pocket, a badge. It was shiny and embossed with a symbol I didn't recognize, but the way he held it made me realize this was no ordinary man. "You're not alone in this," he said. "My name is Captain Jameson. I've seen what happens when people abuse their power. And that officer? He's not going to get away with it." His voice carried a certain finality, as if he had made a promise, and nothing in the world would stop him from keeping it. I didn't know if I could believe him. The world had let me down too many times, had made promises that never came through. But there was something in his eyes that made me think, just maybe, this time would be different. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice weak, but sincere. Captain Jameson nodded and then stood up, motioning for me to do the same. "Just remember," he added, his tone now more serious, "justice doesn't always come easy, but it will come. And when it does, it hits harder than you could ever imagine." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the weight of his words lingered in the air as he turned away and walked back toward his car. He paused, looking back at me for a brief second. "Take care of yourself," he said before sliding into the driver's seat and driving off. I stood there for a moment, still in disbelief, before slowly making my way home. The pain in my chest was still there, but it was something different now. It wasn't just physical. It was a sharp reminder of how easily power could be abused, and how fragile the world could be when someone decided they didn't have to follow the rules. But I had hope now, a glimmer of something that had been absent for so long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure, the officer wasn't going to get away with what he had done to me. And I would be there when justice finally hit hard. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Captain Jameson's words echoed in my head, "Justice doesn't always come easy, but it will come, and when it does, it hits harder than you could ever imagine." But what did that really mean? What could one man, even one with authority, do against a system that had clearly been built to protect people like that officer? I couldn't help but wonder if I had just been part of some grand illusion, a fleeting moment of hope that would fade the second the next challenge came along. Despite my doubts, I felt an unfamiliar weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. I didn't know where this would go, or if anything would actually come of it, but I knew one thing, I wasn't just going to let this slide. I had to do something. It was early morning when the knock on my door came. It was sharp and insistent, the kind of knock that makes your heart race. I opened it, expecting to find a delivery, maybe a neighbor, but instead, I found a man in a suit standing there. "Are you Miss Walker?" he asked, his voice formal and slightly distant. "Yeah, that's me," I said, my voice shaky, unsure of who this man was. He handed me a letter, sealed with an official-looking stamp. The moment my fingers brushed against the envelope, I felt my pulse quicken. "This is for you," he said, his expression unreadable. "I suggest you read it immediately." He turned and walked away before I could say anything, leaving me with the letter, now heavy in my hands. I stood there for a moment, staring at the seal, before pushing the door closed and retreating into my apartment. I ripped open the envelope, unfolding the thick paper inside. My eyes skimmed the first few lines before they stopped, freezing on a single sentence. "This is to inform you that Officer Harlow has been suspended pending further investigation into his actions on, date of incident." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I read them again, slower this time, as if expecting them to change. Suspended. It was a small word, but it felt monumental. A decision had been made. I read on, the letter detailing an investigation into Officer Harlow's conduct, with mention of the alleged assault on me and other similar complaints that had been filed against him over the years. The final line spoke of possible charges if the investigation confirmed what they had already suspected. I dropped the letter onto the kitchen counter, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was bigger. Captain Jameson had been right. Justice was coming, and it was coming for Officer Harlow. But this was just the beginning. I had no illusions about what was to come. The system that allowed abuse to happen would not fall easily. Still, for the first time, I felt like I had a fighting chance. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the letter, feeling the gravity of what it meant, the hope growing inside me, little by little. I was no longer just a victim of circumstance. I was part of something. And I was ready for what was next. The following days were a blur of press conferences, interviews, and mounting tension. The investigation into Officer Harlow's actions was officially underway, and the media had picked up the story. They had plastered my face across every major news outlet: "Black woman kicked by officer, justice begins." At first, the attention felt overwhelming, suffocating even. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and certainly not for something like this. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. My story wasn't just my own anymore, it had become the symbol of something much larger. I wasn't alone in this fight. The calls from other victims started flooding in. Women, men, parents of children, all sharing their own stories of being treated unjustly, abused, and overlooked by the system. It was a ripple effect, and as it spread, I realized just how deeply embedded the problem was. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct, it was about a broken system, one that had turned a blind eye for far too long. Despite the overwhelming wave of media attention and public scrutiny, I felt the stirrings of something new inside me: determination. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't just the woman who had been kicked and knocked down. I was the woman who had survived and was now standing up. But the fight wasn't going to be easy. A few days after the news broke, I received another unexpected visitor. This time, it wasn't a formal letter or someone from the media, it was someone from the police department. I opened the door to find a man in a plain black suit, his expression serious but not unkind. "Miss Walker," he greeted me with a soft nod. "We need to talk." I motioned for him to come in, unsure of what was going to happen next. He sat down across from me, flipping open a folder filled with paperwork. I watched him closely, trying to gauge his intent. "I'm Detective Richards," he said, his voice low. "I'm heading up the investigation into Officer Harlow's conduct. We've already gathered evidence from the incident, and we're taking a closer look at his record." But we need more, witnesses, corroboration, anything that can help us build a solid case. I was quiet for a moment, unsure of how much to say. I've already told you everything, I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. What more do you need? He nodded, not fazed by my tone. The more details we can get, the stronger our case will be. We know this isn't the first time Harlow has been involved in questionable behavior. But we need solid proof to ensure that he's held accountable. He paused, watching me carefully. This is bigger than just one man's career. It's about setting a precedent. I clenched my fists, the weight of his words hitting me hard. A precedent. It was clear now that this wasn't just about getting justice for me. This was about sending a message, that people like Officer Harlow couldn't get away with this anymore. Not when lives were on the line. I took a deep breath. What do you need from me? Anything you can give us, Detective Richards said. Any small detail, any encounter, if you've witnessed any of Harlow's actions before, or if there's someone who might speak out, it could help us build the case. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. Witnesses, corroboration. The detective wasn't just asking for a personal account, he was asking for others to come forward too. This wasn't just my fight anymore, it was everyone's. We'll do everything we can to make sure he faces justice, Richards continued. But it's going to take courage. Are you willing to keep pushing forward? The question wasn't easy, but in that moment, I knew my answer. Yes, I said, my voice steady. I'm not stopping now. As he left, I felt the weight of his words settle on my shoulders. This was bigger than I ever imagined. But now, I had something I didn't have before, purpose. And I was ready to see this through, no matter what. The days turned into a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and more paperwork than I ever thought possible. Detective Richards was persistent, and so were the media. The momentum behind the investigation grew as more and more people started speaking out. It wasn't just me anymore, the floodgates had opened. People who had been too afraid to share their stories for years were now coming forward, their voices gaining strength in numbers. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, reviewing yet another stack of documents, there was a knock at the door. I looked up, startled, and cautiously walked over. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to see Captain Jameson standing there. His presence was still commanding, yet he had an air of calm that made everything feel just a little more grounded. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. I stepped aside, allowing him to enter. We sat down at the kitchen table, where I had been going over statements and evidence. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "I heard about the progress," he said, glancing at the paperwork. "The pressure is building. It's good to see people speaking out. But you're going to face resistance, big resistance. This is bigger than Harlow. There are people in positions of power who don't want this to go any further." I nodded. I'd already known that. The higher-ups, the ones who could protect Harlow and sweep things under the rug, would do everything they could to stop this. But now, it was bigger than just one officer. This was about an entire system that needed to be held accountable. "I'm not afraid," I said, more to myself than to him. "I have to keep going." Jameson watched me for a moment, as if weighing my words. "You don't have to do this alone. If you need support, you know I'm here. I've been fighting battles like this for years." His words hit me harder than I expected. The weight of it all, the truth of how deeply entrenched the corruption was, felt even heavier now. I hadn't signed up for any of this. I was just trying to walk down the street when everything changed. But here I was, caught up in something much bigger than myself. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice quiet but resolute. "Now," Jameson said, leaning back in his chair, "we prepare for the fight. You'll face people who will try to tear you down, make you doubt yourself, make you question whether this is worth it. But if we're going to make real change, this is what it takes." The determination in his voice gave me a surge of strength. I wasn't sure what was coming next, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't backing down. The people who had been ignored for so long, the ones who had been trampled underfoot by this system, they needed someone to stand up for them. "I won't stop," I said, a quiet fire growing inside me. Jameson gave a slight nod. "That's the spirit." Before he left, he placed a small folder in front of me. I opened it, and inside was a list of names: people who had worked with Officer Harlow in the past, individuals who had witnessed his behavior firsthand, people who had suffered at his hands but hadn't spoken out. "Use this," he said. "Reach out to these people. They may be afraid, but together, we can get the truth out there. We can put a stop to this." As he left, I sat there staring at the folder, the weight of what it meant sinking in. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about an entire system that had failed so many, and now, I had the chance to be a part of its reckoning. The fight had only just begun, but I was ready. We were ready. And this time, nothing would silence us. The next few days blurred together. I spent every waking hour contacting the names in the folder Captain Jameson had given me, each conversation more difficult than the last. Some people were hesitant, afraid to speak out, terrified of the consequences that would follow. Others had already given up, believing that nothing would ever change. But as I spoke to more of them, something incredible happened. Each story I heard, each person who shared their truth, fueled my resolve. There were stories of officers who had turned a blind eye, of supervisors who had protected their own, and victims who had been silenced for far too long. As each person opened up, the weight of the situation became clearer. This was a system that had been broken for so long, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized just how many people had been complicit in letting it fester. It wasn't just about Officer Harlow anymore. It was about every single person who had been ignored, every single person whose pain had been dismissed. The more I heard, the more determined I became. I couldn't back down. Not now. Not when so many others were depending on me. The calls came in waves. One after another, people who had once felt helpless now found the strength to speak out. They wanted justice, just like I did. They didn't want to live in a world where people like Harlow could get away with what they did without facing consequences. And as I listened to them, I realized we were part of something larger, something that could no longer be ignored. But as the calls kept coming, I also realized something else. The resistance I had feared was closing in on us. I received a visit from one of Harlow's colleagues, a man who had worked with him for years. He came to my apartment under the guise of offering support, but it didn't take long to realize his true intentions. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice low, almost menacing. "You're stirring up trouble. You have no idea what you're getting into." I didn't back down. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," I said, my voice steady, though my heart raced. "And I'm not stopping. Not for you. Not for anyone." He smirked, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place, anger, perhaps, or maybe fear. "You don't understand. People like Harlow. They're protected. They always have been." I met his gaze without flinching. "Then it's time for that to change." He leaned in closer, his breath rancid with the smell of alcohol. "You think you're the first to try? There have been others who tried to take him down. They don't make it very far. Do you really think you can handle this?" I stood my ground, refusing to show any fear. "I'm not backing down. You can't intimidate me." He laughed softly, a hollow sound. "We'll see about that." He gave me one last look before turning and walking out the door, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. I knew what he meant. People like him and Harlow had power, and they would do everything they could to crush anyone who dared to challenge them. But something had shifted inside me. I was done being afraid. The next day, I met with Detective Richards again, bringing with me more names and more stories. The pressure was mounting, and with every conversation, it became clear that this wasn't just about personal justice anymore, it was about exposing a network of corruption, a web of lies that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. "We've got the momentum," Richard said, looking over the evidence we had gathered. "This isn't just about Harlow anymore. We've got the support we need to bring down those who have been covering for him. But we need to move fast. We need to hit hard." And that's when I realized how close we were to breaking it wide open. The fight wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about an entire system of injustice that had to be brought to its knees. We were getting closer to the truth. And the closer we got, the harder it would hit. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever been crushed by this system. And no matter what happened, I wouldn't stop until the truth came to light. The final push came faster than I expected. Detective Richards had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering evidence, compiling testimonies, and connecting the dots. The pressure was on, and the walls were closing in on the people who had tried to bury the truth for so long. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table, a knock on my door jolted me from my thoughts. I opened it to find Detective Richards standing there, his face serious but with a glimmer of something else in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in him before: hope. "We've got it," he said simply. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean?" "The case is ready. We've got enough to charge Harlow and a few others who've been covering for him. We've connected the dots, everything from the past few years. It's all there." A wave of relief and exhaustion hit me all at once. It felt surreal, like everything I had been fighting for, every moment of doubt and fear, had led to this one point. "But there's more," Richards continued, his tone growing darker. "This isn't just about Officer Harlow anymore. There's a whole network we've uncovered. Supervisors, colleagues, even people in the department who've been turning a blind eye to his actions. This is bigger than we thought." The reality of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident, it was about a culture of corruption that had festered for years, hidden in plain sight. But we had the truth now. The evidence was undeniable. "Are you ready for this?" Richards asked, his voice low but firm. I nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready. Let's bring it down." The next few days felt like a blur of press conferences, statements, and final preparations. The world was watching now. This wasn't just about me or the victims, it was about holding a system accountable for the lives it had affected, for the people it had failed. When the announcement came, Officer Harlow and several others have been arrested, pending charges for misconduct and abuse of power, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication. Justice wasn't just a distant hope anymore. It had become a reality. But even as the news broke, I knew this wasn't the end. The fight for real change, for accountability, would continue. The system would fight back, just as it always had. But this time, the voices of the victims, the voices of the ignored and the silenced, had been heard. And the truth had hit harder than anyone could have ever imagined. I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the city below, knowing that this moment was just the beginning. The fight was far from over, but we had made a dent in the armor of a broken system. And no matter what came next, I would keep fighting. For me, for them, for all the voices that had been drowned out before. This was only the first chapter of a much bigger story. And I was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. Justice had finally come.